He was a man who had buried enemies without blinking, a man whose name alone made grown officials sweat through their suits. But he had never once, in 36 years, let anyone see him cry. Tonight, lying still with his eyes shut, pretending to sleep, testing the loyalty of the woman who cleaned his floors and fed his silence, he did not expect her son's tiny hands to be the ones that broke him open. When the boy climbed onto the cold marble beside him and whispered a prayer meant only for God, Seo Junwoo forgot how to breathe. Welcome to Afrokorea Seoul Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe. Rain hammered the glass towers of Gangnam like it was trying to wash Seoul clean of something it could never quite scrub out. Inside the penthouse on the 40th floor, Seo Junwoo sat behind his desk the way he always did, spine straight, tie loosened by exactly 1 inch, eyes fixed on numbers that meant nothing to him anymore. He was the head of the Seo line, the man 3 rival syndicates feared enough to leave Seoul's East District untouched for a decade. He had a face carved by cold discipline and a heart he'd locked in a vault years ago, the day his mother died begging him not to become his father. He didn't need warmth. He needed control. That was what he told himself every night, and every night the penthouse answered him with silence. A few days later, his assistant, Han-sol, stood before him with a folder and an apologetic bow. "Sir, the last housekeeper quit. She said the house feels like a tomb." Junwoo didn't look up. "Find another one. There's a woman. Nigerian. Works 2 jobs already, comes with excellent references from the Choi estate. She has a son, 3 years old. She'll need to bring him during the day. There's no one else to watch him." His pen stopped moving. "A child. In my house. I can look for someone else, sir." He was quiet for a long moment, the rain answering for him. "No," he said finally, surprising even himself. "Hire her." If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. The next morning, Mercy Adi's Chukwoo arrived at exactly 7, an hour before the sun properly broke over the city, holding her son Daniel's hand in one grip and a bag of cleaning supplies in the other. She hadn't slept. She never really did anymore, not since her husband's death 2 years ago had left her alone in a foreign country with a baby and a debt she was still climbing out of. But she stood at the base of that glass tower and told herself the same thing she told herself every morning. Survive today. Love him hard. Tomorrow will come. The security guard at the entrance looked at Daniel with visible disapproval. "Children aren't usually allowed past the lobby." "He's quiet," Mercy said, her voice steady even though her stomach twisted. "He won't be any trouble. I was told it was arranged." It had been arranged. Junwoo had told Han-sol to allow it, but no one had told the guard that the boss himself made the exception, and so Mercy stood there, humiliated, for 3 full minutes before the call came down to let her through. Later that day, she met him for the first time in the hallway outside his study. He was taller than she expected and colder, a man built like a closed door. He looked at her with a flat, assessing stare of someone who evaluated everyone as either a threat or a tool, and for a moment, she thought he might send her away on sight. "You brought the boy," he said. "Yes, sir. I was told." "I know what you were told." His eyes moved, briefly, to Daniel, who was clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed soft from years of comfort. Something unreadable crossed Junwoo's face, gone before Mercy could name it. "Keep him out of my study. And out of my way." "Yes, sir," Mercy said again, swallowing the sting of it, because rent was due and pride didn't pay landlords. He walked away without another word. By the end of the week, the household had adjusted around her rhythm the way water adjusts around a stone, Mercy waking Daniel before dawn, dressing him in the small room off the kitchen the staff had quietly converted into a corner for him, working with a precision and gentleness that the rest of the staff found remarkable given how little rest she got. She never complained. She hummed old Igbo lullabies under her breath while she scrubbed marble that already gleamed, and if anyone asked, she said she was fine. She was always fine, because a mother who admitted otherwise was a mother whose child noticed. Junwoo noticed something else. The house had begun, in small and irritating ways, to feel less like a tomb. He told himself it meant nothing, That evening, he came home earlier than usual, a rare thing, and found Daniel sitting cross-legged in the hallway outside the kitchen, drawing shapes on the marble floor with his finger, tracing invisible pictures only he could see. The boy looked up at him with huge, unafraid eyes, the way children do before the world teaches them who to fear.
"Hi," Daniel said.
Junwoo stared down at him. No one in this house spoke to him so casually. No one in Seoul spoke to him so casually. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm not alone. I'm drawing a dragon for you." Daniel pointed proudly at the invisible marks on the floor. "Because Mommy said you look like you need a dragon. To protect you." For reasons he could not explain, Junwoo's chest tightened. He said nothing, only walked past the boy into his study and shut the door harder than necessary, as though he could shut out whatever had just cracked open in him. A week later, Mercy found herself staying past her hours more and more, not because he asked her to, but because Daniel had taken, without permission, to leaving small folded paper animals on the edge of Junwoo's desk each evening before they left. A crane, a frog, a crooked rabbit that looked more like a cloud. Junwoo never acknowledged them out loud, but Mercy noticed they were never thrown away. She noticed they sat in a neat row on the corner of his desk, multiplying, like a language being built one fold at a time between a man who trusted no one and a child who trusted everyone. "You don't have to let him bother you," she told Junwoo one evening, gathering Daniel's things, bracing for the rebuke she was sure was coming. "He isn't bothering me," Junwoo said, without looking up from his papers. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "No one has given me anything in a long time that didn't want something back." Mercy didn't know what to say to that. She only nodded, took her son's hand, and left before the strange ache in her throat could turn into something she couldn't afford to feel for a man like him. 2 weeks later, the softening between them was still unspoken but undeniable. Junwoo began arriving home earlier, not for her, he told himself, but because the silence of the penthouse had become unbearable in a way it hadn't been before Daniel's paper animals started collecting on his desk, before Mercy's humming started drifting down the hall like something warm following him room to room. He watched her more than he meant to. The careful way she checked Daniel's temperature with the back of her hand before letting him nap. The way she never sat down to eat until her son had eaten first, even when no one was watching. The way exhaustion sat behind her eyes like a permanent guest she'd learned to live with. He found himself, one night, standing outside the small room off the kitchen where she and Daniel stayed late during a storm too bad for the trains to run. He should have called a car. He should have said nothing at all. Instead, he stood in the doorway and said, "There's a guest room. 3rd floor. Use it if the storm doesn't pass." Mercy blinked up at him, startled by the offer. More startled by the fact that his voice, usually flat as stone, had a strange gentleness folded into it. That's not necessary, sir." It wasn't a request, but there was no bite in it. Just a man who didn't know how else to say, "I don't want you out in that storm." She took the room. Daniel fell asleep within minutes, curled against her side, and for the first time since her husband died, Mercy allowed herself to cry quietly in a house that wasn't her own, grieving a life that had asked too much of her for too long, and not knowing that 2 floors below, a man who had never let himself feel anything in a decade was lying awake, listening to the storm, thinking about a boy's paper crane and a woman's exhausted eyes, wondering when, exactly, he had started to care. The next morning, everything nearly fell apart. A rival syndicate, the Beck Line, hungry for the East District Junwoo had held for years, sent a message the only way men like them knew how: violence, dressed up as an accident. A car malfunctioned outside the tower's private garage just as Mercy was arriving with Daniel, tires screeching too close, too deliberate for coincidence. Junwoo's security caught it on the cameras half a second too late to stop the car from clipping the edge of the sidewalk exactly where Mercy had been standing seconds before. She'd stepped back only because Daniel had tugged her sleeve, wanting to look at a pigeon. When Junwoo saw the footage, something in him went cold in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with rage. "Find out who did this," he said to Han-Sol, voice low, terrifyingly calm. "Tonight." That night, for the first time, Mercy saw the other side of Seo Junwoo, not the silent, closed-door man who barely spoke to his staff, but the man whose name made 3 syndicates cross the street to avoid him. He came to check on her and Daniel himself, standing in the doorway of the guest room with a stillness that vibrated with barely restrained fury. "You're not to leave this building until this is resolved," he said. "Either of you." "Sir, I have to work. I have another." "I said," he cut in, and his voice dropped into something dangerous, "you're not to leave this building." Then, quieter, like the admission cost him something, "I won't let anything happen to him. Or to you." Mercy's breath caught. It was the first time he'd said her existence mattered to him at all, and it landed somewhere in her chest she hadn't let anyone touch since her husband's funeral. By the end of that week, the threat had been neutralized. Junwoo never told her how, and she never asked, understanding instinctively that some doors were better left closed. But something between them had shifted permanently in that danger. He no longer pretended not to watch her. She no longer pretended she didn't notice him watching. One evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep on the study's leather couch, exhausted from a full day of helping the housekeeping staff by rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, Mercy found herself alone with Junwoo for the first time without a task between them. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for protecting us." "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know." She looked at him properly, then really looked past the tailored suit and the reputation that preceded him into every room. "But most men in your position would have sent us away the moment there was danger. Made it someone else's problem." "You think I'm most men?" "I don't know what you are," she admitted. "I only know my son adores you, and you let him, even though you don't have to. That tells me something." Junwoo was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sleeping boy on his couch. The boy who left him paper animals and drew invisible dragons and said hi to him like he was just a man, not an empire, not a weapon, not a myth whispered about in fear across the city. "He makes me remember things I buried a long time ago," Junwoo said finally. "My mother. Before everything. She used to fold paper birds too." Mercy's chest ached for him, for the boy he must have been, before whatever hollowed him into this. What happened to her? "She died trying to protect me from my father." His jaw tightened. "I promised myself after that I would never need anyone enough to be broken the way losing her broke me. I built this." He gestured, vaguely, at the penthouse, the empire, the whole cold architecture of his life. "So nothing could ever touch me like that again." "And has it worked?" Mercy asked softly. "Not needing anyone?" He looked at her, and for the first time, the wall in his eyes cracked just enough to let something painfully honest through. "Until you two walked into my house," he said. "Yes." The following morning, everything between them had the fragile, charged quality of a confession that couldn't be taken back. Mercy avoided his eyes over breakfast, unsettled by how much she wanted to close the distance he'd finally admitted existed. Junwoo, for his part, retreated further into work, burying the admission under files and phone calls, because a man like him did not know what to do with wanting something he could not control. But Daniel, blessedly, unknowingly, kept building the bridge between them anyway. A few days later, the boy fell sick, a fever that spiked hard and fast in the middle of the night, the kind that turns any parent's blood to ice. Mercy was in the guest room. Junwoo had quietly insisted they stay there permanently after the incident with the car, and she'd stopped arguing when she felt Daniel's skin burning against her own. She didn't have to go far to find help. Junwoo was already awake. He rarely slept more than a few hours a night, and heard her voice cracking down the hallway, raw with a fear he'd never heard from her before. He didn't ask questions. He carried the boy himself to the car, sat in the back seat with Mercy sobbing quietly beside him, and held Daniel's small hand the entire drive to the private hospital his family had used for 3 generations, murmuring things to the boy in low, steady Korean that Mercy didn't understand but somehow found comforting anyway, the tone of a man promising a child he would not let anything take him. That night, in the hospital hallway, waiting for the fever to break, Mercy finally let herself fall apart. 2 years of being strong alone, of surviving on 4 hours of sleep and stretched paychecks, and a grief she'd never had time to properly feel, cracked all at once. "I can't lose him too," she whispered. "He's all I have left of," she stopped herself. "Of your husband." Jun-woo finished quietly. She nodded, tears finally spilling. "Everyone thinks I'm strong because I have to be. No one asks what happens when I'm not." Jun-woo did something then that surprised them both. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm, grounding, deliberate. "You don't have to be strong in front of me," he said. "Not anymore." She looked up at him, startled by the rawness in his voice, and in that moment, in a sterile hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, something between them stopped being unspoken. By morning, Daniel's fever broke. The doctor called it a common childhood virus, nothing that would leave lasting damage, and Mercy wept again, this time from relief, while Jun-woo stood by the window, quietly, uncharacteristically, wiping at his own eyes when he thought no one was looking. He had not cried since his mother's funeral. He told himself it was exhaustion. He knew, even as he thought it, that it wasn't. 2 weeks later, with Daniel fully recovered and running through the penthouse halls like nothing had happened, the tension between Mercy and Jun-woo had become impossible to ignore. It lived in the space between them at dinner, in the way his hand lingered a beat too long when he passed her a cup of tea, in the way she found reasons to stay later than her hours required, telling herself it was for Daniel's sake, knowing it wasn't only that. It came to a head one evening on the penthouse terrace, the city glittering below them like scattered stars, Daniel asleep inside under the watch of the night housekeeper. "I need to say something," Jun-woo said, his voice low, unusually unsteady for a man who commanded rooms without effort. "And you can tell me I've lost my mind." "Say it," Mercy said, her heart hammering. "I have not wanted anything for myself in 15 years. I built a life specifically, so I would never want anything I could lose." He turned to face her fully. "And then you and your son walked into my house, and every single rule I made for myself started falling apart, and I don't know what to do with that, because I am not a man who is supposed to feel things like this." "Like what?" Mercy breathed. "Like I would burn down everything I've built to keep the two of you safe. Like the sound of your voice in my house is the only thing that's made it feel like a home in a decade. Like I think about you when I should be thinking about anything else." His hand came up, hesitant in a way that felt foreign on a man so certain of everything else, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Tell me if I'm wrong to feel this." Mercy's breath shook. "You're not wrong," she whispered. "I've been terrified of it. Because you're you, and I'm just—" "Don't," he said, sharp enough to silence her. "Don't finish that sentence like you're less than anything. You survived alone in a country that wasn't yours, raised a son who is kinder than anyone I've ever met, and did it all without breaking, even when you had every reason to. You are not just anything, Mercy." It was the first time he'd said her name. It undid something in her chest. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and when she didn't, his hand cupped her face with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything Seoul believed about Seo Junwoo. The kiss that followed was slow, aching, years of loneliness on both sides pouring into something neither of them had let themselves want out loud until now. The next morning, Mercy woke in the guest room with her heart lighter than it had been in 2 years, and immediately terrified by how much lighter it felt. Because lightness, in her experience, was always a setup for the ground to fall away. It did. 3 days later, the Beck line struck again, this time not with a car accident, but with a message left at the penthouse gates, a photograph of Mercy and Daniel walking home from the market days earlier, a single line scrawled beneath it. Asterisk, everyone the CEO heir loves ends up buried. Ask his mother. Asterisk. Junwoo's blood ran cold reading it. Not because of a threat. He'd received 100 threats in his life, but because it confirmed the worst fear he never let himself speak aloud, that loving him was dangerous, that his mother had died proving it, that history, given enough time, always repeated itself around him. That night, he did the thing he swore he would never do to protect the people he loved. He pushed her away. "You need to leave," he told Mercy, voice flat, deliberately cold, the wall back up brick by brick. Take Daniel. Go somewhere far from me. I'll arrange money, a new job, anything you need. But you cannot stay here. Mercy stared at him, stunned. What are you talking about? 2 days ago you told me. 2 days ago was a mistake. The words cost him more than she could know, but he forced them out anyway, because a dead woman he loved as a boy had taught him that loving Seo Junwoo was a death sentence, and he refused to let it become Mercy's. I can't protect you if you're close to me. Don't you understand? Everyone I've ever loved has ended up in the ground. So, your solution is to break my heart to save my life? Mercy's voice cracked, fury and grief tangled together. You don't get to decide that for me. I've buried a husband, Junwoo. I know what loss costs. And I would rather have you and risk it than lose you to your own fear right now. It's not fear, he snapped. It's math. It's 20 years of watching everyone close to me pay for it. Then change the math, she said, tears streaking her face. Fight for something instead of running from it for once in your life. He said nothing. He couldn't. And so she did the only thing her broken heart could manage. She packed Daniel's things that night and left before dawn, taking a room with a distant cousin across the city, telling herself it was better this way, that a heart broken quickly healed faster than one broken slowly. She was wrong, but grief rarely waits for accuracy. A week later, the penthouse was a tomb again, worse than before, because now Junwoo knew exactly what he'd lost, knew exactly what silence without her humming, without Daniel's paper animals, without the warmth that had crept so quietly into every room, actually felt like. He sat at his desk each night staring at the small, crooked paper rabbit still sitting on the corner of it, and for the first time in 15 years, he let himself cry, not from fear, not from loss of control, but from the unbearable weight of having pushed away the only thing that had ever made him feel like a person instead of a name people feared. That same week, he found the men responsible for the Beckline's threat and ended their operation entirely, not with mercy, not with restraint, but with the full, terrifying force of everything Seoul had ever feared about the Seo name. When it was done, the threat against Mercy and Daniel was permanently, absolutely gone. But she was still gone too, and no amount of power could fix that. 2 weeks later, Han Sol found him staring at the paper rabbit again and said the thing no one else in the organization would have dared say to their boss. Sir, respectfully, you eliminated an entire threat network in 4 days flat to keep her safe, but you can't walk across the city to tell her that yourself? Junwoo looked up, something cracking open behind his eyes. She won't want to see me. With respect, sir, you won't know that until you ask. That evening, for the first time in his adult life, Seo Junwoo did something entirely without calculation, without strategy, without the cold armor of control he'd worn since he was a boy watching his mother die for loving the wrong man. He went to find her. Junwoo did not go to her that night after all. Han Sol talked him back, gently, insisting that showing up unannounced at a stranger's apartment as the most feared man in Seoul would terrify a household that had nothing to do with any of this. Let me arrange something, Han Sol said. A reason. A way, and that doesn't look like desperation, even though it is. The next morning, the reason arrived on its own. Mercy's distant cousin worked, unknowingly, as a part-time server for a charity gala the Seo Foundation was hosting that Friday, a gala Junwoo had ignored for 3 years running, always sending Han Sol in his place. This year, for the first time, he confirmed his own attendance personally, and made sure, through channels no one questioned, that Mercy's cousin's household received an invitation as staff family small enough not to draw attention, deliberate enough to guarantee Mercy would be there. That Friday evening, the ballroom of the Seo Foundation glittered with a kind of wealth that made ordinary rooms look pale in comparison, but Junwoo saw none of it. He saw only the far corner, where Mercy stood in a borrowed dress that fit her like it had been made for someone else's life, holding Daniel's hand, looking like she wanted the marble floor to swallow her rather than be recognized. He crossed the room without hesitation, ignoring the dozen conversations that tried to claim him along the way, and stopped in front of her with none of the composure Seoul believed he was made of. You came, he said. I didn't know you'd be here. Mercy said stiffly, already turning to leave. Wait. His hand didn't touch her. He'd learned that lesson already. But his voice stopped her anyway, raw and unguarded in a way that drew curious eyes from every direction, eyes he didn't care about for the first time in his life. I was wrong. I have never in my life said those words, and meant them the way I mean them now. I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong to let a dead threat write the rules of my future. I ended it, the Beck line, the danger, all of it, and it changed nothing because you were still gone, and I understood, finally, that the thing I was so afraid of losing I lost anyway, by my own hand. The room had gone quieter around them, but neither of them noticed. You don't get to say that here, Mercy whispered, tears already threatening. In front of everyone. I know, he said. I'm done hiding what matters to me. I did that for 15 years, and it cost me my mother's memory, and almost cost me you. I'm not doing it again. He knelt, not fully, not a proposal, not yet, but low enough to be at Daniel's eye level, the boy watching the whole exchange with wide, solemn eyes. I'm sorry I let you both go, Junwoo said to the child directly. That was the worst decision I've ever made. Daniel, with the uncomplicated honesty only children are capable of, simply hugged him. Mercy broke. That night, they didn't resolve everything. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend in a single evening no matter how sincere the apology, but they agreed to try. Mercy moved back into the penthouse a week later, this time not as staff, but as something neither of them had a name for yet, something that felt, for the first time in years, like the beginning of a family instead of the maintenance of two separate, exhausted lives. A month later, in the quiet hush of a Tuesday evening, Junwoo decided he needed to know something for certain, not about Mercy, whose love he no longer doubted, but about the boy who had cracked him open in the first place, about whether what he felt for Daniel was real devotion, or simply the residue of guilt and grief tangled together. He needed to know, without performance, without an audience, whether the boy's affection for him was as genuine in private as it was in front of others. So, he did something strange, something he would later be embarrassed to admit to anyone but Mercy. He lay down on the study couch after dinner, closed his eyes, and pretended to be asleep. Daniel, who had taken to wandering into the study most evenings to leave his paper creations on the desk, found him there minutes later. The boy paused, studying the still, closed-eyed figure of the man who had become, without either of them naming it, something like a father to him. Junwoo, eyes shut, heard small footsteps cross the room. Felt the couch dip slightly as Daniel climbed up carefully beside him, the way children do when they think an adult is fragile and sleeping. He felt a small hand rest gently on his chest. And then he heard the boy's voice, barely a whisper, folding his hands the way Mercy had taught him before bed each night. God, please don't let anything bad happen to him. He protects me and Mommy. He doesn't smile a lot, but I know he loves us. Please make him happy forever.
Amen.
Junwoo's eyes snapped open before he could stop them, and for the second time in his adult life, in front of another person, Seo Junwoo cried. Not the controlled, private grief he'd allowed himself over the paper rabbit alone in his study, but full, unguarded tears, the kind he hadn't let himself have since he was a boy of 11 watching his mother's coffin lowered into the ground. Daniel, startled, patted his cheek with small, clumsy comfort. Don't cry. I said a good prayer. It's supposed to be a happy one. It is. Junwoo managed, pulling the boy into his chest, holding him the way he wished someone had held him at 11 years old. It's the best one anyone's ever said for me. Mercy found them like that minutes later, the most feared man in Seoul, undone completely, holding her son like he was the only solid thing left in the world, and she understood, watching them, that whatever fear had once kept Junwoo from letting himself love fully was gone now, burned away by a 3-year-old's unguarded honesty. 2 months later, on a terrace overlooking a city that no longer felt cold to either of them, Junwoo knelt properly this time, a small velvet box in his hand, Daniel standing beside him holding the ring because the boy had insisted, solemnly, that it was his job as the man of the family to help. I spent 15 years building walls so nothing could ever hurt me the way losing my mother hurt me, Junwoo said, Mercy's hands trembling in his. And then a woman who owed me nothing walked into my house with her son and tore every single one of them down without even trying. I don't want walls anymore, Mercy.
I want you.
I want him. I want whatever this is for the rest of my life. Marry me. She said yes before he finished the sentence, laughing and crying at once, and Daniel cheered loud enough to bring half the household staff running to the terrace in alarm. 6 months later, they married in a small, private ceremony that mixed both their worlds without apology. A Korean processional followed by Igbo drumming that had half the Seo family's stern old guard dancing before the night was through. Daniel dressed in a miniature suit that matched his new father's, beaming with the particular joy of a child who finally, fully, had everything he'd once quietly prayed for. 1 year later, in the same penthouse that had once felt like a tomb, Mercy sat on the terrace at sunset, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, watching her husband chase a shrieking, delighted Daniel around the garden with a water hose neither of them was supposed to be using indoors. Well, technically outdoors, but Junwoo had long since stopped caring about rules that didn't matter. He caught her watching, jogged over, dripping and laughing in a way Seoul's underworld would never have believed possible of Seo Junwoo, and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to the swell, where their second child was growing. Happy, she asked, though she already knew the answer. I used to think happiness was a weakness, he said, resting his hand over hers. Turns out it was just waiting for the right people to walk into my house. Behind them, Daniel folded one more paper crane and set it gently on the terrace table, adding it to a collection that had long since outgrown Junwoo's desk and now filled an entire shelf in the nursery being prepared down the hall. Proof, in careful, crooked folds, of a family built not from fear, but from a child's honesty and a love that finally, fully, chose to stay. Welcome to Afrokorea Seoul Stories. Don't forget, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel.